G'day friends, family, fellow patriots. Lord Stompy here in Adelaide, South Australia. Welcome to the show. This video is part 2 in my series, The Cultural Genocide of Traditional European Man. For part 1, check out my link in the information box and click that. I highly recommend it. Alright, in part 1 of this series, I was talking about how the core narrative and the core identity of the European people as traditional European people here in this modern day, that has been almost totally destroyed. Okay, and that was done by design. And in that video I was talking about how this war to culturally genocide the European people and turn them into a bunch of technocratic slaves, that really began to kick off at the turn of the 20th century. And by my estimation, that war really did kick off in a big way with the start of World War One, which, from all the research I've done, was a deliberate war planned by the banker, industrialist, merchant classes, who were the rising power in Europe at that time. And that war was designed to destroy the traditional Europe that our ancestors grew up in. It was the beginning of a very, very long, drawn-out war. And we're in the middle of that war now. It's still dragging out, and this is why things are getting very bad for the European people in the West at this point in time. The war is not over. They are going to continue to subjugate and destroy the European people, which was their plan all along. And these bastards aren't going to stop until their plan is completed, and it's not completed yet because they've not completely subjugated and destroyed the European people. So in my first video I was pointing out how warped the hearts, the minds and the souls of European people have become in this modern era. We are but a shadow of our former selves. If you look at the great European heroes of the past, the great artists, the great intellectuals, and the great warriors, and the great leaders, the modern era, all through nationalist circles now, you just continually hear how dull and mediocre and insipid and bland the modern era is. We live in an era surrounded by luxury, opulence, high-tech gadgets. The world is at our fingertips, and yet the character of man has completely devolved in recent generations. Where are the great men? Where are the great women? Where are people like Joan of Arc, or Richard the Lionheart, or Galileo, or Da Vinci? The great leaders, the great warriors, the great innovators, the people who made great sacrifices for our people. So as a people, our souls, the European people's souls, have been in decline for generations. Despite all the external trappings of success and the great gadgets and wizardry that we now have at our fingertips, the people themselves are entering a very, very long-term slump. And as I exhorted in my first video, this is something we need to remedy as quickly as possible. So the war in Europe really. At the turn of the 20th century, the rising powers were the banker, industrialist, merchant class, and they had their sights firmly set on destroying the old order of Europe, the old traditional order. They had to destroy Europe being ruled by nobility and the church. And the European nobles and the church had a very even balance of power for well over 1,000 years. So this was a very long established European order. And I would like to say here that most of the European greatness and the great achievements of Europe were achieved during this time when Europe was ruled by the church and by nobles. So during that period, which we now call antiquity, our people went through the most innovation. Our people were at the most vigorous, dynamic. We were creative. We were incredibly independent. We were hardy. We were taking on the entire world, and the people under the church and the nobility built Europe up to be the greatest power that the world has ever seen. And so as the 20th century dawned and we had a very rapid increase in modern technologies and the modern liberal era was beginning to dawn, large amounts of wealth and power were now being accumulated by the bankers, the industrialists, and the merchants. So these were the classes that were most infested by Jews, and these chattering classes really wanted to take over the reins of power themselves, and to do that, they had to not just end the old order in Europe, but they had to wage a war of cultural genocide on the European people. Now, this was very, very carefully planned, and it was outlined in Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi's notorious book of 1925, Praktischer Idealismus, which is also known in nationalist circles as the Kalergi Plan. So Coudenhove-Kalergi was the first guy to publicly propose in his 1925 book that Europe should be flooded with African and Asian migrants, and that all the different European nations and cultures should be erased and bred into a mongrel people. And eventually Europe would become a mono race and a mono culture. And this was his own words. He said, we will replace the diversity of people with the diversity of the mind. So this is an incredible statement. This is Coudenhove-Kalergi's statement of intent. Replace the diversity of people with the diversity of the mind. Now, what was traditional Europe like during the time of 1925? I have quite a good idea what Europe was like. My grandparents were alive during that time. And my grandmother told me that growing up in the 1920s and 1930s England, that she told me these wonderful stories that basically just the island, the very small island of England, was basically an entire continent to itself. it was teeming with diversity. And this is back when England was 99.5% white. Okay? So England was incredibly traditional during that time. It was incredibly parochial. And my grandma was working class. She lived in Manchester all her life until she migrated to Australia in the 1950s. But she told me that 1920s and 1930s England, if you took a train from Manchester just 45 minutes or a single hour, and you went somewhere like Somerset, suddenly you were immersed in a culture that was so different it was mind-boggling. They had a completely different accent and dialect, a very different way of life, a very different outlook, a very different worldview. And so when my grandma told me stories about visiting these different counties in England, her eyes would light up, because as a young girl and as a teenager, this was like visiting a foreign nation, right? And she told me that the few times she visited Scotland, that Scotland was so foreign. It was just so different to the rest of England. Back 90 years ago, that she said the Scottish accent back then was so thick that she could barely understand what they were talking about. These were people who were like complete alien foreigners to her. So only 90 years ago we had in England that was just the entire small island of England was just this teeming with a massive amount of vibrancy, diversity. All these small little localized cultures had taken hundreds of years to just slowly form and grow into their own organic, kind of their own little world unto themselves. So this was the world that Coudenhove-Kalergi and his buddies, they had to destroy, okay? Because what we're talking about here is a Europe that every different corner of Europe, every small little place in Europe was really, really different. And the problem that these 20th century technocrats had was, and Kalergi talks about this in his book, a lot of Kalergi's statements seem like very highfalutin, puffed up nonsense. And it is true, they are, but if you really think about this highfalutin, this bizarre highfalutin talk, some of the things he says, they're truly terrifying. Kalergi was talking about in one section of his book how the man of the country is a man who is polluted. And basically Kalergi says this in this highfalutin way, but I'll translate it so it makes sense. He said, the man of the countryside, the rural man, is polluted by dirt and soil and parochialism. And so what he's talking about here is the soul, the high diversity of the European soul is of no use to the technocrats, right? The soul is of no use, but then Kalergi goes on to say that the cosmopolitan people of the city are these refreshing, wonderful people because they have the freedom of the mind. So this once again goes back to his idea. We have to replace the diversity of the people with the diversity of the mind. So what Kalergi was talking about is that the localized parochial European man. So what I mean by that is the European man who is born into an area and is very loyal to that area. The traditions of that area are deeply ingrained in him, and they're deeply a part of his core identity and his core narrative. In fact, that whole man's, if we look at a person who 100 years ago was born as an Ulster Scot in Belfast, and he'd have this really, really strong, deep identity of being an Ulster Scot of Belfast. Well, such a man as that was of no use to Kalergi and his technocratic buddies, right? Because they could not manipulate their minds enough to turn them into cosmopolitan technocrats. That is when Kalergi is praising the city because they're cosmopolitan and they have this freedom of the mind. What Kalergi is saying is that the cosmopolitan people in the cities have lost the deep traditionalism of their European soul, and they've replaced it with this cosmopolitan, liberal, technocratic mindset. That's the kind of people that Kalergi and his technocratic Jewish buddies want. And the only way they could see to achieve that was by flooding Europe with just tens of millions of foreigners and forcing everyone to interbreed into this confused human zoo. And then indoctrinating them, mind-fucking them with generations and generations of liberalism so that they lose all core identity and values, and that they all just become these modernistic, liberal, technocratic mind slaves. And that where we're at now is that's exactly what's happened to us. It's absolutely incredible. Kalergi actually really 100 years ago, he wrote the blueprint for this, right? This is what the elites wanted, and they would have had plenty of think tanks about this. The elites are very thorough. When they come to a conclusion after all their think tanks and they put a plan into action, man, like they are patient, they are ruthless, they are cunning. If it takes them 5 or 10 generations, so be it, right? We're dealing with a different order of thinking in this war. Like our enemy is thinking in a completely different sphere to us. They're thinking 5 or 6 generations ahead. They're thinking of psychological warfare at the highest level. They're continually working out the latest and most cunning way to mind fuck us, to cheat us over, to cheat us out of our inheritance as European people. So where we've ended up now, and I said this in my last video, is really, let's be honest here, a ground zero for the European people was the late 60s, when the hippie revolution came in all across the West. I mean, suddenly you had rock stars all becoming Hindus, and it was the dawning of the age of Aquarius. That was the last of traditional Europe, and most of the boomer generation, not all, but most of the boomer generation made the decision to become liberal mind slaves, to completely disassociate themselves from any traditional European values and any traditional European identity. And they flung all that in the bin, and they jumped headlong into the liberal technocrat dream that was presented before them by the media, by the education system, by the political establishment. And that, yeah, in my last video I said the liberal boomers ended up being the tabula rasa generation. And this was the cultural genocide of traditional man was completed in their generation. And once they'd destroyed the core narrative and, you know, the traditional European soul of the European people, then the time was right to open the floodgates on immigration, because the elites knew that without any traditional core European values and we had no traditional European core narrative left in our own souls, that they would have very little pushback once they opened up the physical war against our people. The physical war was the opening the floodgates of the immigration. That's been a key factor in this war against our people. So this is exactly where we're at. If you rewind, and I pointed this out in my first video, if you rewind the clock 100 years ago to Europe, and you took liberal Europeans from now back to, say, the example I used last time was 1913. The modern liberal European, the woke modern liberal European would be seen as an absolute abomination. They would be seen as an absolute alien to a European of 100 years ago. And this is no small thing. Our people have had their souls, their psyches, their hearts, their minds absolutely just completely disfigured out of any resemblance of anything traditional and European. And we are now in Babylon. All our core narratives, our individual core narratives as European people are now so fragmented and so crazy that we're finding it hard to work together as European nationalists just to save our people, because all our individual core narratives have become so damaged that we have trouble understanding each other. That's a problem. It's a massive problem. All right, I'm going to continue this part 3. Deus Vult. God bless.